Hi, my name's Dr Adam Booth and welcome to another online edition of Quantum Source. Now this week on Quantum Source we are talking all things Bonfire, and of course a lot of our traditional Bonfire night celebrations come from Guy Fawkes and his rather explosive plans for government back in the 1600s. And so today we are talking explosives and the effect of explosions on buildings. Now before you get the wrong end of the stick, this is not a manual for how to blow up buildings. We're turning this around on its head and we're asking the question, how do we engineer buildings so that they're as resilient as possible to explosive damage? And this is the field of expertise of today's speaker. He is Dr Sam Rigby. He's a senior lecturer in blast and impact engineering in the Department of Civil and Structural Engineering at the University of Sheffield, and we're going to be giving him a bell in just a second. Now, as with all quantum sources, there's a recommendation that fascinating facts are best served with something refreshing, and so as the nights start to draw in and we get nice and cold and bonfire-y, you put on an oversized sweater and you get yourself a dark beer. This is maybe not the darkest beer out there, but it's certainly the darkest one that I got in the house. It's a nice bottle of Black Sheep, and of course you drink enough of these and you will feel like there's an explosion going off in your head anyway. So you get yourself something nice and we'll give Sam a call. Cheers. And good evening, Sam. How are you doing?
Yeah, I'm good, thanks. How are you, Adam?
I'm all right, thank you. The nights are drawing in and it's actually a little bit nippy in this room, but we're all good. Now then, just before we talk explosives, I imagine that alcohol isn't usually a component of your explosives test lab, but when you finish down there for the day, you might like to kick back and relax with a recommended source, right?
Yep.
So what can you recommend me for after a hard day of exploding things?
So I was desperately trying to find a beer with some sort of pun in the title, something to do with hop explosion or something like that. Anybody who knows me knows that I'm a huge craft beer snob. So I had to pick a craft beer. So I just went for the Old Faithful, my favourite beer, which is Heathen by the guys at Abbeydale Brewery. It's brewed like less than 2 miles from my house, so super local. Right. And also it is kind of in keeping with the Guy Fawkes theme. They probably thought that Guy Fawkes was a heathen.
Yeah, all right. Sort of that's exactly the kind of tenuous link that we like to contrive.
Brilliant.
So
if I can
thanks
do
for
one
the recommendation.
Thing, it's tenuous. That's about all of that.
Nice one. Okay, cool. So let's talk explosives then. Can I get you to share your screen?
Yep, no problem. So thanks, Adam, for inviting me to give this talk for Quantum Source. I'm going to talk about Guy Fawkes, Beirut, essentially what we do as engineers to understand explosions and to make sure that buildings and infrastructure and things like that are designed with explosive loading in mind.
Okay.
So this is, it's not necessarily a content. I'm not going to go through this in order, but this is just a general overview to give you a flavour of what I'm going to talk about. I'll cover each of these, not necessarily in this order, but some of the things that I want you and the audience to take home from this talk. So I'll be spending a lot of time talking about what actually is an explosion, what makes it so damaging, so what are the effects of the explosive and how does it interact with obstacles and buildings and things like that. I'll then talk about what we can learn from things like Beirut, so the Beirut explosion back in August, fairly large scale, fairly well documented explosion. We can learn a lot about explosives and damage to infrastructure and buildings from cases like that. And then, as promised, the tenuous link into Bonfire Night. I'll talk about what might have happened had Guy Fawkes not been caught. So what would have happened to the Houses of Parliament if the Gunpowder plot had been successful? And then ultimately, kind of the overriding theme, I guess, is what's the point in all of this? Why do we need to understand this as scientists and engineers? And it's essentially to better design buildings to save lives.
All right, cool.
So a bit about myself. So I'm a senior lecturer in blast and impact engineering in the Department of Civil and Structural Engineering at the University of Sheffield. So my research specialises in quantification of the blast loading. So there are a lot of fantastic research groups around the world that look at things like material characterisation under extreme loads, and structural response and that side of things. Whereas me and my research group, we mainly focus on the explosive itself, what happens very shortly after it detonates. And we do experimental work, we do numerical modeling, and also a particular interest of mine is this thing called quick running methods or fast running engineering models. So what can we learn about experiments and modeling? What does it teach us, and how can we distill that into fairly simple models that engineers in industry might use? We have access to a small scale explosive test site. I guess small scale depending on who you ask. It's around about 1 kilogram of TNT, or up to 1 kilogram of TNT. So it's kind of mid-range. 1 kilogram of TNT will be about the size of a cricket ball.
Okay.
So, and yeah, as I said, we focus on what happens in those very first few instants after an explosive detonates, and that's kind of where we've made our name as a research group, focusing in on that real extreme area immediately after an explosive goes off. So these are some photographs of the Blast and Impact Lab. They're from some of the rare sunny days that we get out in Buxton. So somebody once described it as a brutalist Hobbiton, and I think they absolutely nailed it. I can't think of a better way to describe the site. So it's just these series of kind of partially submerged reinforced concrete bunkers. It used to be a munitions store during the Second World War. University acquired it in the 70s or something like that, and then we've been running. We've been running it as a test site since the 90s, early noughties, before my time anyway. So yeah, this is what it looks like. So this is where we do our experimental work. I'll talk a little bit about some of the things that we do here during the talk, but it doesn't feature as a kind of a main component of what I'm going to talk about. But if anybody is interested, they can find me on Google Scholar or on Twitter or anything like that, and have a look at some of the papers that we've written on some of the novel experimental techniques that we've developed out at this weird and wonderful site. So I think it's worth talking a bit about the motivation for why we do these things. So sometimes I get quite passionate about explosives and the effects of explosions, and I don't want that kind of scientific enthusiasm to detract from what the main motivation is, and that's essentially to make sure that we are better informed when it comes to designing buildings to be resilient against the extreme loads that we get from things like impacts and explosions. So from a scientific perspective, essentially, if we understand explosions, or if we are better able to measure them and quantify them and predict what will happen, then we can be better at designing buildings to be resilient against blast loading. I think it's also worth saying that the aim isn't to prevent any building from ever sustaining damage. Otherwise, we'd be living in bunkers, and it would be cost prohibitive. We don't. That's not the aim of blast protection engineering. It's not to stop damage from occurring. It's just to make sure that buildings are equipped to deal with that damage. Sometimes it can be highly localized. That's one of the big differences between the area of blast engineering compared to, say, earthquake engineering, where the whole building might shake. In blast, it tends to be smaller components. So here, you can see this column here that I'm highlighting by the cursor, the one that the arrow is pointing to. Look at the damage that was sustained by that column, and the damage to the glazing. There's loads of rubble on the street, but importantly, this building on the right-hand side has stood up. Some quite catastrophic damage to that column, but the building's still standing. So that is the aim of blast protection engineering. It's to make sure that if a building does sustain damage, the damage is as localized as we can achieve, as localized is as realistic, and to make sure that damage doesn't spread and propagate to other parts of the structure. So this is a photograph from the IRA bombing at Manchester Deansgate in 1996. So the Gunpowder plot, a little bit of a history lesson. So I'm not a historian, I'm an engineer. But it was a plot by Guy Fawkes. I'm sure the audience know this. I'm sure that's probably one of the reasons why they're watching this video. It was a plot by Guy Fawkes and some of his conspirators to blow up the Houses of Parliament. So it was an act of terror. They were aiming to make a political statement, cause casualties for the important people who are congregated in the Houses of Parliament. I think the target was the King at the time as well. It happened on Bonfire night, funnily enough.
Funny that. I mean, he couldn't have timed it better, could he?
Well, they probably thought it's the best time of year to source fireworks and gunpowder, isn't it? So,
right, absolutely. Why not?
All the shops had them in stock, and
yeah, right.
So the plot itself, they had 2.5 tons, or around about 2.5 tons of gunpowder in barrels in the cellars at Westminster. The plot was foiled. The Palace of Westminster didn't blow up, or the Houses of Parliament didn't blow up. Guy Fawkes was caught, and that's why we burn an effigy of him every year to commemorate this act of terror, which always seems a bit odd. But part of this talk is what would have happened if he hadn't have been caught, if he had been successful, and if that gunpowder had detonated, what would have happened to the Houses of Parliament and the surrounding area as well. And then what do we know about explosions, and what have we learned since Guy Fawkes, and in particular in recent years as well, in recent history. So what is an explosion? That's probably the question on everybody's lips. It's very, very different to the explosions that you might see in the Hollywood movies, the Michael Bay films, things like Die Hard, some of the James Bond movies, where it's a big flash, you see loads of fire, loads of burning, and relatively little effect to the people nearby. There's that song, Cool Guys Don't Look at Explosions. They always just walk off looking nonchalantly whilst it's burning behind them. In reality, a real life explosion is quite different. It looks less spectacular, but it's a heck of a lot more damaging. And a lot of the effects of an explosion we can't actually see with the naked eye, which is part of the reason why movies have all this fire burning, because it's nice and slow and it's something that we can see.
Right.
So a real life explosion is a lot more damaging, a lot quicker, and a lot less spectacular to the naked eye. So this is a video, a high-speed video of a old police car. A load of explosives have been put in the boot of the car, and yeah, I think this is a promo video for the high-speed video camera. But you can see a particular feature of the explosion, which is what does all the damage. So I'll play it through once, and then I'll go back a couple of times just to show you the important things. So you see the explosion, you can see all the fire and all the nasty things happening here. Yeah. Did you see it, Adam? Did you see what happened quite early?
Yeah, there was some kind of like a weird white, I'm going to call it a shockwave, but whether it's a shockwave or not, I don't know. But there was this weird kind of shell that exploded away from the car.
Yeah, perfect. You hit the nail on the head there. Yeah, that's exactly what it is. So if I play it through once again.
There he is.
There, yeah. So that disturbance that you see there, that's a high-speed video camera picking up the shockwave.
Right.
What's actually happened here is this is just a shell, as you described it. It's a very good word to describe it. Okay. It's a shell of very, very highly compressed air. It's so highly compressed that it's actually changed the refractive index of the air.
Right. Is that distortion of is it the sea or whatever behind it? It's
yeah. So in the same way that on a really hot day when you look at the pavement and you can see the air looks like it should. That's because the refractive index of the air has changed, and this is something that we see here as well. So the refractive index of the air has changed because the compression is so high. So we can actually see the shockwave in high-speed videos, and just look how quickly it travels away. Approximately hemispherical. It forms into a hemisphere eventually, and then it's gone. So that is what the problem is here. This shockwave, this thin shell of air, and that's what my research is aimed at understanding and protecting against.
Okay.
So I want you to do a little thought experiment / visualization for me, Adam.
All right.
And play along at home as well for those guys who are watching this. I always struggled to comprehend what the magnitude of pressure was when an explosive detonates. I didn't really have anything in my mind to compare it against. So I've come up with this example. So hopefully it shows to you what the extreme conditions are after an explosive detonates. So this is, immediately it's kind of the theoretical maximum pressure that's reached. Clearly, as the explosive detonates, it begins to expand, and that's what forms the shock wave. It's the air is being compressed as it tries to move out of the way. So it very, very quickly loses that pressure, but the theoretical maximum pressure is this value that I'm going to talk about. So, right. So I want you to visualize a 1 by 1 by 1 meter cube of water. Mm-hmm. So shown by this excellent cartoon here.
There we go.
So the density of water is 1,000 kilograms per meter cubed, or 1,000 kilograms per meter squared per meter height.
Yeah,
so the sort of the mass of water that's acting on this red square, 1,000 kilograms per meter squared for every meter height. Mm-hmm. This cube of water is. So if we put that into a pressure, we multiply it by gravity. Let's call it 10 because I'm an engineer. It's close enough to 10. So the pressure is 10 kilonewtons per meter squared, or 10 kilopascals. Mm-hmm. So for every meter height, we gain 10 kilopascals in pressure. So now I want you to imagine you're stood in London. You can see Big Ben. Big Ben is about 96 meters tall. So let's call it 100. Again, I'm an engineer. 96 is close enough to 100. So I want you to picture a column of water the height of Big Ben.
Right.
So one meter by 1 meter on its sides by 96 meters tall. Mm-hmm. So the pressure acting at the bottom of that column of water is about a megapascal.
Yeah.
It's 10 kilopascals times 100 meters.
Yeah.
A megapascal. So now I want you to imagine that somebody has taken Big Ben, copied it 24 times, and stuck them all on top of one another. So I couldn't do it in this cartoon because it would on the page. But imagine you've got 25 Big Bens stacked.
We've got very big, long, and thin Ben.
Yeah.
Right.
Slender Ben.
Right.
So imagine we've got Slender Ben, 25 Big Bens tall.
Okay.
Just made of a column of water.
Yeah.
So the pressure acting at the bottom of that column of water is 25 megapascals.
Okay.
25 megapascals is about the strength of concrete. So if you took a block of concrete and put it, if you had a hatch at the bottom of Slender Ben and put the concrete in, it would crush. That's how large that pressure is. So pressure in an explosive immediately after it detonates is equal to 25 Big Bens worth of water.
Wow.
You ready? Times 1,000.
Oh wow. Okay.
So
exactly.
Yeah, mind blowing. 25,000 Big Bens full of water, and the pressure acting at the bottom of that is the same as what is instantaneously released when an explosive detonates.
Right.
So you can see
concrete really doesn't have a chance.
No. So the air itself has no option but to move out of the way.
Yeah.
And the air moving out of the way is what causes it to bunch up. It's basically a traffic jam in the air. That traffic jam then travels out. So anyway, I'm going to talk a little bit about explosives and also scaling. So scaling is one of the things that we can use to learn from things like Beirut and things like the experiments that we do at our Buxton test site. First of all, I'll talk briefly about the time of arrival of a shockwave, because it's actually a very, very useful metric. If you know how far away you are from the source of an explosive, and you can find some way to measure the time it takes to arrive from detonation to reaching you, you know its velocity. Essentially, you know its average velocity. From that, you can work out its pressure. Mm-hmm. So essentially, arrival time is a way that we can measure blast waves without actually having anything in the way to measure that pressure. We don't need to measure the pressure itself. We can just measure times. Okay. And this is some information that the early pioneers of the nuclear age used quite well. Clearly, they didn't want to instrument their test arena with things that were going to be subjected to huge pressures and excessive radiation and the things that you get from a nuclear explosion. So they used this quite cool technique to measure arrival time, and then from that they could infer what the pressure was. So this video that I'm going to show you is from one of the nuclear trials. So it's just a rig where they set off it's essentially a smoke flare. So if I just go back a couple of frames, so they set some smoke up. The smoke goes up vertically. you'll see a big flash, which is the moment of detonation. So from this video, they know the detonation time. They can work out what the time was from that flash. That's when the nuclear explosive detonates. Then there'll be some delay as that shockwave travels from the source. It will hit these smoke sensors, these smoke tracers. It will move them. And then when they begin to move, that's when the blast wave has arrived.
Okay.
So we'll just play it through again. So you can see they set the tracers off. The test is about to begin. You'll see the flash from the detonation. Then there's the delay. And there, the blast wave hits.
Yeah.
Play it again. So yeah, smoke tracers, detonation coming up. So if you count this time now, that time there gives you the arrival time.
Yeah.
So we can use the time of arrival to do some quite neat things. And it's one of the things that we did as a group to actually determine what the approximate size of the Beirut explosion was.
Okay.
So this plot that I've shown on the left-hand side, this is fairly well-known semi-empirical method for predicting blast parameters. There's all sorts of relationships with distance. So you can do things like pressure, arrival time, duration of the loading, and the momentum or impulse of the load. I'm just going to focus on arrival time, time of arrival, TOA.
Okay.
So this plot is the relationship that was compiled from all manner of tests from between around about 1 kilo to around about 400 tons of explosive. They use scaling to collapse it all onto the same line. This doesn't show the individual data points. This just shows the representative relationship. So the scaling itself, effectively, it's all scaled back to 1 kilogram of explosives. So you can see the units are meters per kilograms to the third. So meters per cube root kilogram. So if you've got 1 kilogram, your scaled distances and your actual distances are identical. Similarly, your scaled arrival time is milliseconds per cube root kilogram. So again, if you've got 1 kilo, you can just read directly off the graph. So for example, at 25 meters from a 1 kilogram explosive, your arrival time is going to be about 65 milliseconds.
Okay.
So that's how scaling works. It gives us this nice benchmark. It means that if we know this general relationship, we can take our data and we can fit it to a curve for any number of explosives and work out what actual size would give us the best match, which is what we did. I'll show you an example of that in a couple of slides' time. Okay. So we verified this. Like I said, it's a very well-known relationship, but we did some tests a few years ago at our Buxton test lab. The aim of the study wasn't to validate these predictions, but we could. We had the data to do so. And look how nicely the experiments fit on that line. So it's pretty good. It's a nice, definitive, accurate and repeatable way to measure explosions if we take that arrival time, the time of arrival. So over to Beirut. So the events occurred on the 4th of August this year. A large explosion in one of the warehouses in the port of Beirut caused by, so they were storing 2,750 tons of ammonium nitrate, which is, on its own, it's not an explosive, but it is a component of explosives. And there were various things in the warehouse that set up this chain of events that caused it to detonate. So I'll play this video and then I'll go through frame by frame just to show, what it was. If you haven't seen it, it is quite shocking. I believe I believe this was filmed by a camera on a tripod, and the person whose camera or phone it was uploaded this to social media afterwards. So I'm assuming that they're okay. I'm assuming that they're unhurt by this, but it is fairly shocking to look at. So you can see the fire round about in the centre of the frame. So you can see the detonation, the moment of detonation, then you can see the destruction that blast wave causes as it propagates. Yeah. So
and it really is shocking. Just like it's astonishing how quickly that travels to the observation point. Yeah,
it really is terrifying, and it kind of it's exactly why I do what I do.
Yeah.
If I can, if my research can help people to better understand things like this and put measures in place or design buildings in a slightly better way, then it's all good. It's helping people. this video is particularly good at showing the devastating effects of the explosion. So if I just sort of go through in slow motion, you can see keep an eye on the buildings in the foreground. So look what happens to them as that shockwave travels over. So you can see windows are blown out, all sorts of rubble's thrown up. I mean, it's scary. It's really scary. Also, if you keep an eye around about here on this side of the frame, you can actually see the shockwave itself. So if I go back and forth a bit, you can see that disturbance. Do you see the disturbance there, Adam?
Yeah.
Yeah. So that's actually the shockwave. I think a big misconception about the Beirut explosion was this big cloud, this big opaque thing that's coming towards the camera. People assume that was the shockwave. It's not actually the shockwave. That's behind the shockwave, and it's just water in the air that's condensing.
Okay.
I could bore you forever about it. It's called a Wilson cloud. If anybody's interested, Google Wilson cloud. It's a feature of explosions, but it's not the shockwave. And actually, you can see. So if you get to about here, you can see that those buildings. So this building here, that glass is smashed, but this fog cloud hasn't even reached it yet.
Yeah.
So the shockwave is traveling in front of this cloud, and catastrophic damage. So the explosive the explosion occurred here, right next to this grain silo. Grain silo completely obliterated. All these warehouses in the port were destroyed. If you take the area over which damage was seen, so broken glass and debris was seen up to 2 miles away. That's an area that more than 750,000 people live.
Yeah.
So think how many people were affected by this. If you talk about broken glass, it's not headline grabbing, it's not building collapse, but it's gonna put people out of their home. It's gonna close businesses down. So a lot of people were affected in a lot of ways from this explosion. Yeah. And if that's just a thing of learning how to design glass better, to provide toughened glass for buildings that are near ports that store explosive materials, that's something that we can learn from Beirut. So this is the sort of damage further into the city. So buildings in the port themselves were just completely obliterated. And these are some of the buildings within the city itself. And it looks like the sort of damage that you'd get from a hurricane, a sort of, more so than that, but a sort of storm that might last days. It might go on for several evenings, and you might return and see this sort of damage. This was just one single event. This was just one hit of the shockwave, and it's caused all this damage. We look at this car, look at that door, completely caved in, and that's just from air. That's from air that has been compressed and travelled outwards and then interacted with these obstacles and caused all this damage. So catastrophic, very, 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 very devastating event that was caused. So what we can actually do, I spoke a bit earlier about the time of arrival and how it's a useful measurement to quantify explosions and to better understand explosions. I'll just show you an example of what we actually did as our research group. So we've written this up in a paper. It's freely available online. It's open access. So if you could do a bit of shameless advertising for me, Adam, and stick it in the video description.
Yeah, absolutely. We'll link to it so the whole world can see.
Brilliant. So this is kind of a very, very abridged version of what we did in that paper, but it's using the knowledge of the time of arrival and that relationship, the graph that I showed earlier. So if I go back to the video, what I want you to do, Adam, is count in your head time it takes from when you see the explosion to when you hear the explosion.
Okay.
What did you get?
I reckon something like 4 seconds.
Yeah, so something like that. 2, 3, or 4 seconds, depending on how quickly you count. So what we did is we did something a lot more. No offense, Adam, a lot more accurate than this. We actually so we looked at the video frame by frame to work out the precise moment that the explosive detonated, and then we looked at the audio signal. So the video itself was probably filming at about anywhere between 24 to 30 frames a second, so 30 pieces of information per second, whereas the audio files were sampled at kilohertz, so thousands of samples per second. So you can actually precisely determine the arrival time from a spike in the audio signal. Yeah. And then you can work out the time of arrival from basically subtracting when that detonation occurred. It's something that that people are probably familiar with whenever there's a thunderstorm. Something that you always say, if you want to work out how far away a thunderstorm is, you count the time it takes between seeing the lightning and hearing the thunder. This is essentially what we did here, where the lightning is the detonation and the thunder is the shockwave. So we did that for a number of videos available from social media. We went through frame by frame. So as an example here, these are just a few sequential frames in the video. So frame 36, there's still a fire. Frame 37, there's a flash. Frame 38, there's a fireball. So in the space of 3 frames, in the space of 3/30ths of a second, we've gone from something that was a fire in a warehouse to a ball of fire that's 80 meters tall. That the grain silo next to it is 60 meters tall, so it's a bit taller than that. So think of the volume of that fireball, and that was surrounded by air. That air has to go somewhere, so that air moves out of the way, and that's what forms the shockwave. And then frame 104 and frame 105 is when the camera's knocked over. So you can see, we know roughly the amount of frames, but like I said, we looked at the audio signal to do this more precisely.
Yeah.
And this is what it looks like. So we used 16 videos. We could determine where they were filmed. We went on Google Street View. We did a bit of detective work, and we pinpointed where each of these videos were. For each video, we had the time of arrival that I just showed you. So from the lightning to the thunder, from the detonation to the arrival of the blast wave at the camera operator's position. But also there were certain recognizable landmarks in some of the videos. There were some big buildings, and we could work out when they started, when the glass shattered on those buildings. We could work out when the shockwave had arrived at that particular building. So we had 16 videos, and I think we had about 38 data points in total. So then what we did, this gives us our distance versus time plot. So it's not scaled anymore, it's in actual real units. So then essentially what we did is we took the semi-empirical data, and we tested loads of different sizes of explosives, and we picked the one that represented that data in the best statistical sense. And it happened to be a nice round number of 500 tons of TNT. But we did a little bit of sensitivity, and we're reasonably confident that it's somewhere between 500 and 1,000 tons of TNT. Or that's actually a typo. That should be 1,100. In the paper, it's between 500 and 1,100, or 0.5 kilotons and 1.1 kilotons. Just to put it into context, the atomic bomb that was dropped on Hiroshima at the end of World War II was around about 13 to 15 kilotons. So it's 10% the size of the bomb that was dropped on Hiroshima. And everybody will be able to picture the damage that was caused to Hiroshima from that bomb. So it's not a million miles away from the damage caused by a nuclear explosion.
Yeah, wow.
But yeah, we were able to determine this just from social media videos. So people who were filming the fire and then thankfully uploaded their video to social media afterwards, we could do actual reasonable science from it. So
that's really impressive, and you're obviously harvesting every single bit of information you can get about this explosion. Yeah,
we could probably tighten that error bar. We have done some work since that suggests that it might be closer to sort of 800, 900 tons. But for quick science, using relatively coarse measurements in the smartphone video data, it's as good as we can do. And the error bars are fairly generous. We could narrow them down, but and also the that estimate 500 to 1,100 tons, that agrees with what seismology data suggests as well. So people picked up very faint tremors in the earth, hundreds of miles away, and they were able to calculate between 500 and 1,100 tons of TNT as well. So there's an increasing amount of evidence out there to suggest that it is within that range. So you're probably thinking, well, you know the yield of the explosive, so what? What can you do from that? Well, we can use this concept of scaling to draw parallels between what did happen in Beirut and what might have happened in the Gunpowder plot. So if we take the lower estimate of Beirut and say 500 tons of TNT, the Gunpowder plot was approximately 1 ton of TNT. So it was 2.5 tons of gunpowder, but gunpowder isn't as powerful as TNT. And TNT is the reference explosive. It was used a lot during World War II when these sorts of codes were developed and when people started really studying explosives. So it's kind of the benchmark that we use. So there's around about a 1 to 500 mass scale factor between Beirut and the Gunpowder plot, or a 1 to 500 energy scale factor, which means that the length scale factor is about 1 to 8. An energy and a weight is something that's attached to a meter cubed, whereas a length is something that's attached to a meter. So one way to think of it is if you have two spheres, if sphere 2 is 8 times the radius of sphere 1, it's 512 times the volume.
Okay.
So it's 8 times 8 times 8.
Yeah.
Which means if we know the yield, we can take the cube root of it and we can work out what that length scale factor is, which gives us around about 8. Again, I'm an engineer. It's not exactly 8, but let's call it 8. Which means that if we can survey the damage from Beirut, and for example, we see a particular damage occurring at 800 meters from the center of the explosion, we can expect to see a similar level of damage 100 meters away from the Gunpowder plot, because it's shrunk down by a factor of 8 on its length scale. Which means we can access the sorts of damage levels that researchers developed during the Blitz, during World War II. They wanted to know what the sort of safe perimeters were from certain sizes of explosives. It scales up reasonably well as well, so we can use it to plot damage levels from Beirut. So that's what I'm going to do now. I'm going to show what the damage we saw from Beirut was, and then show what would have happened if we get the same damage levels but 1/8 scale in London. So the 5 types of damage levels are in order of decreasing severity and increasing distance. So the first one is complete destruction. So anything within this radius is just completely flattened. The second level, so a bit further out from that, the buildings are unsafe. So they might have had fairly severe structural damage. They won't be safe to go in. The third damage level is uninhabitable buildings. So those are buildings that walls might have come down on the inside, glass might have broken, things like that. The fourth damage level is minor structural damage. So you can still inhabit the building. You need to make repairs, certainly, but still it's safe to go in. And the fifth damage level is superficial damage. So things like smashed windows is a good example of that. What I'm going to do now is I'm going to plot those damage levels on Beirut. So this first graph, my damage radii come from the laws that they came up with in World War II. So there are equations that say if you're this far away from this size of explosive, you can expect this type of damage. So if I plug those numbers in, I won't show the equation just because we're not here for equations, are we? We're here for videos of explosions. So the first damage radius is 300 meters, and that's complete destruction. And that ties in fairly well with that photograph I showed of all the warehouses that had been flattened. So anything within 300 meters of the center of that explosive would have just been razed to the ground. Second damage level, if you put the numbers in for Beirut, is about 450 meters. So any building within that radius, and you can see that it's still the warehouse type buildings in the port, but we're verging on these residential buildings that are next to the port. So those buildings would be classified as unsafe. The damage level for uninhabitable buildings is 750 metres. Minor structural damage is 2.2 kilometres. Wow. And superficial damage, you can't even fit on this graph, it's 4.4 metres. 4.4 kilometres, sorry. And that ties in with reports of windows smashing 2 or 3 miles away. So these rules of thumb that were conceived of in World War II map over quite well to the Beirut explosive. So we can be satisfied that those equations that we use and those means that we use to determine the levels of damage are fairly accurate. And this was this appeared in the New York Times, and this mapped over the actual damage that they saw in Beirut. So you can see heavy damage to buildings close to the explosive, which is what we've seen, and then moderate to heavy damage out to a mile and extending a bit more in this direction. So again, if we could just go back a slide, so uninhabitable buildings at 750 meters and minor structural damage to 2.2 kilometers. That's kind of what we see from Beirut.
Okay.
Now, what would the damage radii be if the gunpowder plot had been successful? So what we can do is we can take those circles that were on Beirut, shrink them down by a factor of 8, and then drop them onto central London. And this is what it looks like. So complete destruction would have occurred to any building within 34 meters of the cellar.
Wow.
which neatly encompasses the Houses of Parliament, certainly the central aspect of the Houses of Parliament. Yeah. I should just say at this point, the damage radii are assuming that the explosive occurs kind of out in the open.
Okay.
For the gunpowder plot, they were hidden in the basement. So, creative license, artistic license, I guess I should say. But let's assume that the explosives were at ground level. This is what the damage would have been. So complete destruction out to 34 meters, buildings unsafe out to 50 meters. So those buildings would require demolition. They wouldn't have been demolished by the explosion, but you couldn't go in them. There's no point even trying to salvage them. Whereas buildings out to 86 meters would have been completely uninhabitable. Buildings out to 250 meters would have seen minor structural damage, and then we would have seen superficial damage out to 500 meters. So I know the London Eye wasn't there at the time, but if you were in the London Eye and the gunpowder plot would have been successful, you'd have been just on the cusp of the capsules being smashed because of the blast wave. Give or take the accuracy of this method, it's conceivable that the pods in the London Eye would have smashed had the gunpowder plot been successful. Next time anybody's in London and you're near the London Eye, look over at the Houses of Parliament and just try and get a sense of what that distance is. 2.5 tons of gunpowder doesn't sound like an awful lot, but when you're 500 meters away, you can see, wow, the amount of buildings that are encompassed by this damage radii. So that's the damage maps put over onto Westminster. So that's I've reached the end of what I wanted to talk about. Just to kind of summarise where we are as a group and where my research is headed. I'm focused on understanding the effects of explosions, and I always say when I interact with structural engineers in industry and other researchers, other academics, I always say we're the guys who work out what the exam question is. The explosion does something to the structures. It sets a challenge to the structures, and then the structures have to answer that challenge. So I always say if you're sitting in an exam and there's a really garbled exam question that doesn't make any sense, you can't produce a good answer. Similarly, if you don't have a good idea of what the explosive loading is, you can't produce a good protective structure. So our research is saying, well, let's tidy up this question. Let's understand what explosions are and what they do to buildings, and therefore let's pose that as a challenge to the structural engineers to then design things in a better way. The small scale testing that we've done on site, we can use it to verify empirical laws. We can use it to show that scaling itself is valid, which is a huge advantage because it means we can do Beirut style explosions and Beirut style studies very, very small scale. So we can do them repeatedly, we can do them quick, we can do them inexpensively, and also safely. So there are lots of advantages to small scale testing, provided they're scientifically valid, which I've shown in this presentation that they are because there is that read across. So we can use the scaling to look at things like Beirut, look at explosions that occur in the real world, and say, what damage did we get? Where did that damage occur? How does that relate to the size of the explosive and the power of the explosive? And then the final point, which is what everybody's come to hear, if Guy Fawkes hadn't been caught, the Houses of Parliament almost certainly would have collapsed. There would have been catastrophic damage. If the whole building wouldn't have come down, it certainly wouldn't have been usable and would have had to have been demolished. So the conspirators on the Gunpowder plot certainly would have achieved their means.
Right.
And we can say that reasonably definitively from looking at things like Beirut and what we learned from that. So yeah, it's not a morbid fascination that I have with explosions. It is done so with the intention of helping improve safety and help people. I have to end on a shameless self-promotion. There's no point in doing these sorts of things unless it bags you a few Twitter followers. So if anybody liked what they heard from this, I'm fairly active on Twitter. I like to tweet about my research. Whenever I'm out at the lab doing some experiments, I like to send photographs. And if I'm doing some computer programming or anything back in my office or at home, as it currently is, I like to show graphs and GIFs and things like that. So if you do have an interest in learning more about explosions, then do please give me a follow. And with that, I'm done. Did you have any questions, any comments, any criticisms, Adam, that you'd like to share?
Yeah, well, first I'll just get you to unshare your screen. Okay, so Sam, thank you very much. It was really fascinating insight to the world of explosives. I did have a couple of questions, if I might. One
sure.
of them is that I don't know how old the kind of field of explosives research is and whether the conspirators in the Gunpowder plot really knew quite what they were doing in the way that we do today. Do you think that they had an idea that much gunpowder would do the job, or was it just get as much as you can and hopefully it will?
Yeah, I can't imagine that they were that well informed about the exact effects of gunpowder. I think it is like what you said. I think they did what they could get away with. They found what they could source, and it's part of the reasons why I said right at the start about the aim isn't to prevent buildings from ever getting damaged, because somebody can always make a bigger bomb.
Yeah, right.
So the aim is to control that. So yeah, I suspect that they knew it would go bang, they knew it would be damaging, and they bought as much as they possibly could.
Yeah. The other question was that at your test site, you were saying that you're kind of limited to explosives of a kind of kilogram size. What's your main limitation on that? So
it's mainly the neighbours.
Right.
So it's mainly noise limits.
Okay.
For those who are nearer to us. So there's a farm that's a few kilometres away. So we tend to keep it to a kilogram just because otherwise it's not fair to subject people to loud repeat noises. So yeah, our license covers us up to a couple of kilos. We have a different part of the site where we can go up to about 5 kilos, but it's not hugely more. And we've found that because the scaling is so good, we don't actually need to go that. We can go up to a kilogram, but our standard test size is around about 250 grams.
Okay.
So yeah.
You've got those scaling laws just to upscale it anyway.
Yeah, and it's still 250 grams sounds a little bit piddly, but you wouldn't want to be near it when it detonates.
Right. Yeah. Absolutely. Yeah.
It's still pretty scary, and it's still quite kind of whoa.
Yeah. Okay, well, Sam, with that, we'll leave you to your evening. What I would say is to the Quantum Source audience out there, you saw Sam's invitation to get in touch. I'm sure he wouldn't mind if you've got any questions that you want to put to him. But yeah, give him a follow. Cool.
Yes, please.
All right, then, Sam. So yeah, we'll catch up soon, and you take care.
Cool. Yeah, you too. Thank you very much for inviting me to do this, Adam. See ya.
No worries. We'll see you in a bit. Bye bye. So some really awesome research insight from Sam, and it's fascinating to learn that the gunpowder plot really could have worked. Now, that's the last of our Bonfire Night Quantum Source specials, but if you enjoyed that, then do keep your eyes on the Quantum Source Twitter and Instagram feeds. There's loads of other videos from the lockdown summer and some other bonfire ones for you, and we will be doing a few more seasonal specials before, hopefully, I can see you all again in the real world for a live Quantum Source. But it just remains for me to say that I've been Dr. Adam Booth, this has been Quantum Source, you've been great, stay well.